In April of 1987, Princess Diana Spencer opened the United Kingdom's first HIV/AIDS unit at London Middlesex Hospital, which was built to specifically take care of individuals who suffered from HIV/AIDS. There was a widespread fear associated with HIV/AIDS, as there was a lot of stigma associated with the disease. In the early years of discovering HIV/AIDS, there was an uncertainty as to how it was transmitted, which caused fear and terror in the public. Diana, in a moment of compassion, which she probably had no idea of the outcome would come from this singular moment, she shook the hand of a man who suffered from AIDS. Previously, it was believed that this terrible disease was passed through touch. That photograph taken of her shaking the man's hand was revolutionary in changing the way that the public viewed the disease. She showed the world that there was nothing to be afraid of. There was much effort from scientists to combat HIV/AIDS, which included developing blood screening tests and public awareness campaigns. While we as humans have made great strides in the past couple centuries, we still have so much further to go. As recent as 2017, there has been restrictions on transgender individuals being able to serve as their chosen gender in the military. While that restriction has been lifted since the time of this recording in 2024, there is a permeating fear throughout the United States that LGBTQ rights are once again in jeopardy. This is part 3 of the LGBTQ rights movement. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. In 1981, on June 5th, a report in the MMWR, also called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, was published. In the report were requests for the drug pentamidine to treat a deadly disease called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, which had happened in 5 healthy young men in Los Angeles, California. There was also a spike of Kaposi sarcoma in gay men in New York. Both of these diseases were rare and were also associated with a lowered immune system. That same summer, the CDC formed a task force. Immediately, they believed that the issue was due to an infectious agent that could be passed through sexual contact, although there was much speculation that it could be passed through intravenous drug use, as it was also starting to be seen in heterosexual individuals. The transmission through blood was confirmed when immunosuppression was found in 3 people with hemophilia. Hemophilia is a blood disorder where blood doesn't clot properly, which means even small cuts can be dangerous for someone who has this disorder. CDC and other scientists gathered to figure out the best way to prevent this occurring via transmissions, and they started to develop guidelines to screen the blood. In July 1981, they started to figure out how these men's healthy immune systems were compromised. This work started a theory that it was an infectious agent, not a genetic defect. In 1982, a first commercial blood test called ELISA was licensed by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Using different enzymes, the lab technician will be able to see by how the blood interacted with the enzymes whether or not there was HIV antibodies in the blood. There was a lot of stigma behind the AIDS epidemic. Since it was so new and not understood yet, there was a fear that people could get AIDS from someone just via touch. It didn't immediately gather attention as it was only a select few individuals around the states that had contracted this. What started a widespread panic in Americans was when these cases started to be reported in infants and people with hemophilia. In 1985, Ryan White, who struggled with hemophilia, had contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion. There was a fear that he was going to expose other children to AIDS, and so Ryan was no longer allowed to attend school. That same year, Rock Hudson, a Hollywood icon, died of complications from AIDS. He was the first major U.S. celebrity to die of the disease. This helped raise awareness of the epidemic. It had been previously ignored as it was considered to be a gay plague. Hudson was even friends with Ronald Reagan, and Reagan said that after Hudson's death, it changed his view on the disease. The issue with that is that Reagan didn't bother to address the issue of AIDS in a public speech until 2 years later. By that time, over 20,000 Americans had died, and the disease had spread to over 100 countries. In 1988, the World Health Organization declared December 1st World AIDS Day. Greg Louganis, a 4-time Olympic gold medalist and considered to be one of the greatest divers in history, had come out publicly as gay in the Gay Games in New York City. He later wrote a book called Breaking the Surface, which discussed his experience in the Olympics and his coming out journey. He was diagnosed with AIDS in 1988. Another famous celebrity that had also died of AIDS not too long after Rock Hudson was Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen. He had not publicly revealed his diagnosis until the day before his death on November 24, 1991. He suffered from bronchial pneumonia, which destroyed his immune system. He was only 45 years old. In 1986, the Surgeon General's report on AIDS was issued by U.S. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop. In the report, he stated that there needs to be comprehensive sexual education and urged widespread use of condoms. In the report, the rumor that it could be passed through mosquito bites was also dispelled. The next year, the CDC launched a campaign called America Responds to AIDS, also called ARTA. The goal was to increase awareness and understanding of AIDS and to prevent HIV infection. It encouraged people to start seeking more information and counseling, and there were also programs to support HIV prevention with minority groups, in particular African American and Hispanic communities. One extraordinary woman that I want to mention is Ruth Coker Burks. I was reading a story on the Guardian website about the first time she interacted with an AIDS sufferer, and I had an emotional reaction as the story is heartbreaking, but it also provides hope in the darkest of times. At the age of 25, she was visiting a friend in the hospital, and there was one room that she walked past that had a red tarpaulin over it with biohazard stamped across it. The nurses were fighting amongst each other as to who should go into the room, and Ruth thought as she was watching them to pull straws to determine who would help this young man that she decided that she was going to go in there. On the bed was a young man named Jimmy who was very thin and pale. She asked him if she could help him. He asked for his mother. Ruth then went to a nurse and asked her if she could get in touch with the man's mother. The nurse told her that his mom wasn't coming and that no one was coming. Ruth was able to call his mother, but she hung up the phone on her, stating he was dead to her the second he came out as gay. At the time, in 1984, in Arkansas, it was illegal to be gay. Ruth went back into Jimmy's room, sat down beside him, and held his hand. In his confusion, he thought she was his mom, and so she decided at the moment this is what she needed to be for him. She sat with him for 13 hours until he passed away. Jimmy wasn't the first patient with AIDS that Coker Burks had helped. There were many more who turned to her when they had no support. She took care of them, befriended them, supplied medication, and stayed with them in their last moments. Quote, "I was there when they took their last breaths so many times I can't even count." End quote. She would ransack supermarket dumpsters at dawn to try and find food to feed these individuals. That was until Bill Clinton, at the time the governor of Arkansas, had directed food banks to help her out. When these gay men who had HIV passed away from the disease, she would put their ashes in cookie jars that she bought cheaply from a friend and buried them in her own cemetery plots. She also worked at the time at a sawmill, a racetrack, and selling timeshares, and she also had a young daughter named Allison. She was ostracized for her kind work. She said that it was like she was contagious. The church didn't want her to be on the finance committee anymore, and children were no longer inviting Allison to their parties. Twice the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross on her lawn. Coker Burks herself had experienced abandonment as a child. Her father had died when she was only 5, and her mother would drop her off at the orphanage intermittently. She said that, quote, I did feel that abandonment. I understood what these men were going through. I never thought of myself as an activist. I just thought I was doing what I was supposed to do." End quote. As for the men she helped, they, quote, "just call me by my name and they just loved me. I mean, can you imagine dying and still giving love? They gave me the love that they needed for themselves." End quote. On August 18, 1990, the Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Act was signed into law. It focused on providing care exclusively to those with HIV/AIDS. This caused Coker Burks to become obsolete. She tried to find work within the campaign, but she couldn't find any. Even Clinton, who was president at the time, couldn't help. She eventually found a job at a funeral home and was also taking tourists fishing. She bought her last cookie jar in 1995. She keeps the jar empty, thinking there would be someone else. In 1993, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell laws were passed for LGBTQ people serving in the military. Before this, there was a ban on LGBTQ people doing military service, and this Don't Ask, Don't Tell law was a way to create forward progress within the gay rights timeline. Except that the law basically continued to cause people to live in fear, and they could not live openly about being gay or queer without the threat of being outed by their fellow officers. Margaret Witt, an Air Force flight nurse, was discharged from the military in 2004 due to homosexual conduct after she had been in the military for decades. She went to court and argued that the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law was forcing LGBTQ members to have to stay in the closet, which violated their constitutional rights. This decision to fight back helped change the course of American history, as she won the case that the military forcibly outing her had violated her rights. She was reinstated as an officer and retired honorably as a major. In 2010, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act was repealed. In 2012, on the same day that same-gender marriage became legal in Washington state, Witt and her partner, Lori Johnson, were able to tie the knot. In a picture of them at their courthouse wedding, they are victoriously holding up a wedding certificate and celebrating a beautiful and joyous moment together. Quote, "It was a true triumph in feeling whole and feeling humanized. In fact, our friends had that photo blown up and framed, and that was our guest book, and that's up in our house. It's really a wonderful memory." End quote. A pivotal moment in how gays were being viewed in the media is when Ellen DeGeneres made the decision to come out on her show, Ellen, in 1997. DeGeneres had been planning on coming out in public as well, and she was hoping that by addressing her fictional character's sexual preference, that it could help provide a direction for the show. The show was the first TV series to have a gay character announce that they were gay. The coming out episode received support and, unsurprisingly, backlash. Some letters that were sent in were thankful and appreciative. Supportive celebrities wanted to come onto the show, including Oprah Winfrey, Demi Moore, Billy Bob Thornton, and Laura Dern, who played a potential love interest. The backlash was tough, though, and DeGeneres received hate mail. Religious figures such as Reverend Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson called her Ellen DeGenerate, and a letter went around that called the show, quote, "a blatant attempt to promote homosexuality," end quote. DeGeneres told Page 6 in 2017, quote, "I had no idea the amount of hate. I had no idea that there would be death threats or a bomb scare. It was a really scary time," end quote. DeGeneres' personal life was also affected by the episode. In an interview with Oprah Winfrey, Winfrey asked her why DeGeneres felt it was necessary for both her and her character to come out. And DeGeneres said, quote, "Because it's okay. I realized as long as I had the secret that I worried about all the time, that it made it look like something was wrong," end quote. The coming out episode, also referred to as the puppy episode, won a Peabody and an Emmy Award. The comedy ended up being canceled a year later in 1998. Despite the backlash that DeGeneres and the studio faced, this coming out episode broke barriers. In that same year, Will and Grace was released on TV about a gay man living with a straight woman. Gay characters were starting to dot the landscape of television shows and movies. Jane Lynch, who also identifies as gay, said that DeGeneres' coming out made it much easier for her. She told DeGeneres, quote, "Can I say thank you for what you bravely did more than 20 years ago?" End quote. Laura Dern, who played a role in the puppy episode, had said that she had significant backlash and troubles in her own career after the episode aired. She said in an interview with New York Magazine that she was honored to take on that role, but before she played it, she was getting a lot of concerned calls from individuals, including advisors in Hollywood that were out gay men, that told her it was not a good idea to take on the part. She thought the concerns were ridiculous, and she went on to the show. Quote, "We only did it for 10 days? We all spent the next couple of years really struggling in work and safety. It was radical to experience that. It was the only time I ever experienced having to have full security detail." End quote. She also said of the experience, quote, "What was amazing, which I will never forget, that when she, Ellen, looked in my eyes, she said it was the first time she said, 'I'm gay' out loud. We didn't rehearse it. So when she said it to me and was looking in my eyes and holding my hands, I felt her shaking. The gift. It makes me want to cry. The gift of that, the intimacy of what that means, was such insight for me." End quote. On October 7, 1998, two men named Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson abducted 21-year-old Matthew Shepard. They drove him out to an isolated area. They tied him to a split-rail fence, beat him up, and left him to die in the cold. He was found 18 hours after he had been beaten up by a bicyclist who initially thought the petite young man was a scarecrow. Ironically, when Matthew was in the hospital in a coma from his injuries, he was only a couple doors down from McKinney, who fractured his skull in a brawl that he had been in a few hours after he and Henderson had attacked Shepard. Shepard had welts, lacerations, and bruises all over his body. His brainstem had been damaged and he had hypothermia. He died of his injuries just days later on October 12, 1998. This is one of the most notorious hate crimes in United States history. McKinney and Henderson were both arrested, convicted of murder and kidnapping, and were sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms each. Since the attack on him was so violent, his death was the center of the outcry against anti-hate violence. Notorious Westboro Baptist church members were protesting the funeral. To combat these individuals, a group called Angel Action was formed to block the protesters by wearing white robes and big angel wings. What was a frustrating aspect to this is while McKinney and Henderson are most certainly where they deserve to be, serving life in prison, they were not charged with a hate crime. This eventually led to the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act that was passed by Obama in 2009, with Judy Shepard, Matthew's mother, by Obama's side. The new law expanded what the definition of a hate crime was, and that included any crimes that were instigated due to an individual's perceived gender or gender identity. Also included biases motivated by race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. It gave the Department of Justice the ability to investigate and prosecute hate crimes against LGBTQ victims. Matthew's parents also created the Matthew Shepard Foundation, whose mission is for, quote, individuals to embrace human dignity and diversity, and to replace hate with understanding, compassion, and acceptance, end quote. His life was chronicled in the play The Laramie Project, as well as the musical Considering Matthew Shepard, as well as many other films, documentaries, and even songs. One individual whose hate crime that has been documented in film was the brutal sexual assault and murder of the transgender man, Brandon Teena. His story was made into a film called Boys Don't Cry, starring Hilary Swank as Brandon Teena. I would highly recommend this film, but please note that it is a disturbing film and it may not be suitable for everyone to watch. In 2003, Houston police responded to a reported weapons disturbance in the home of John Lawrence's apartment. Upon entering Lawrence's apartment, they found him engaged in a sexual and consensual act with another man, Tyron Garner. The police arrested both men, and they were convicted of deviant sexual intercourse, which violated a Texas statute that forbade 2 members of the same sex to engage in certain sexual conduct. This ended up being a landmark case that went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and in a 6-3 decision, it invalidated sodomy laws across the United States, which made same-sex activity legal in every state and U.S. territory. Justice Anthony M. Kennedy said that, quote, their right to liberty under the Due Process Clause gives them the full right to engage in their conduct without intervention of the government. The Texas statute furthers no legitimate state interest which can justify its intrusion into the personal and private life of the individual, end quote. 5 years later, in 2008, California passed Proposition 8, which stated that only marriage between a man and a woman is valid in the state of California, which passed with a 52% yes vote. There were 3 lawsuits that challenged Proposition 8 that were filed the next day. Previously, in 2000, there had been a law, Proposition 22, that had banned gay marriage was unconstitutional. Eventually, Proposition 8 was found also as being unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 2013 and allowed for gay couples to legally marry in California. In 2015, the court voted 5-4 that the right to marry is a fundamental right guaranteed to all same-sex couples. It mandated the decision that states must allow same-sex couples to marry legally. Now, what becomes more relevant than ever, in 2017, President Trump tweeted out that the government will not accept or allow transgender individuals to serve in the military. This apparently blindsided the Pentagon, who had no idea that he was going to tweet that. The new policy, which the Department of Defense said was not an actual ban, but was incredibly problematic. The idea was that currently serving transgender people who had already received a diagnosis of gender dysphoria could continue to serve in the military in their preferred gender and receive hormones and undergo gender-affirming surgery. However, anyone who was interested in joining that was transgender, that had already had the diagnosis of transgender dysphoria, had taken hormone treatments or undergone gender-affirming surgery, could not enlist. For individuals who were later diagnosed with gender dysphoria that were already in the military were going to have to serve as their gender assigned at birth and were not allowed to take hormones or have gender-affirming surgery. Trump said of the ban in a statement that didn't seem to really say much or explain his thinking at all, quote, I have great respect for the community. I think I have great support, or I've had great support from that community. I got a lot of votes, but the transgender, the military is working on it now. They're doing the work. It's been a very difficult situation, and I think I'm doing a lot of people a favor by coming out and just saying it. As you know, it's been a very complicated issue for the military. It's been a very confusing issue for the military, and I think I'm doing the military a great favor, end quote. In January of 2021, President Biden signed an executive order that repealed the transgender ban in the military. Trump's ban had previously been considered discriminatory and had been condemned by LGBTQ activists. Individuals had been discharged from military had their cases re-examined. Jen Psaki, White House press secretary, said that, quote, President Biden believes gender identity should not be a bar to military service, and that America's strength is found in its diversity. America is stronger around the world when it is inclusive, end quote. After the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the next fear that people have, especially those in the LGBTQ community, is that gay marriage is going to be overturned, as it has been legal for a lot less time than abortion has been. In December 2024, 3 different states, California, Colorado, and Hawaii, voters passed ballot measures that would amend language of their state's constitution to help protect gay marriage. With homosexuality no longer being considered a mental disorder in the DSM, it makes me wonder how long it will take for society to no longer see gender dysphoria as a mental disorder. To me, being transgender or questioning gender identity is normal. It's an organic part of being a human being. It's completely okay to not feel like you belong in the gender that you've been assigned, and you aren't alone in feeling that way. With everything that has happened recently in the election in the United States in 2024, it's a terrifying time to be an LGBTQ person. And as a person who identifies in the Q category, I'm also scared. But the most important thing to remember is that we are all in this together. This human experience, and those who love and support you are still going through difficult times. And just know, to those listening, that I appreciate you more than I can possibly express. I want to end this from something that Octavio Gonzalez, an associate professor of English and creative writing at Wellesley College and an expert on the Harlem Renaissance, said about the LGBTQ movement. Quote, "Only now are we looking back to find inspiration. In those moments in history, teaching this history will help us diversify the true rainbow of queerness." End quote. Please subscribe to my podcast. And if you are listening on iTunes, please give the podcast 5 stars. It really helps me get out there. I am currently on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X, so follow me on social media as well. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, production, and editing is done by Lauren Powers. Theme song is done by Mike Meyers, and you can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.